Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me today is Cade Burks. Cade, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me, Chris. Look forward to our conversation.
I've been looking forward to the conversation myself. I'm looking forward to finding a little bit more about your background, what you do, and then about North American gas and some of the challenges and things happening there. That's going to be an interesting conversation for me.
Sure. Well, I'll give you a little background here. I am the Chief Digital Officer here at Big Data Energy Services, and I'm also Vice Chair over at NASB, the North American Energy Standards Board. And so been in the wholesale and retail gas business here in North America since the mid to late 90s when that opened up from a regulatory perspective.
And so since the 90s, you were at a little Houston company called Enron back in the day?
Well, Enron hired us back in the 90s when they needed to do all the EDI. So at that time, it was GISB, the Gas Industry Standard Board. And when they deregulated, they decided that the pipelines and the marketing group should speak EDI. And so we developed the protocols within GISB. We did all the internet security and connectivity testing, and so that was the start of EDI 25, or in the gas business anyway, 25 years ago.
What are the problems that you're trying to solve? What is NISB doing, or what are you trying to solve professionally? What's keeping you awake at night?
Well, right now we're going through certainly a very big transition, with natural gas being a bigger part of the electrification of the grid. So we see a lot of changes in and around that NASB focuses on, Big Data Energy focuses on. But I'll start off with the sort of the inefficiencies in and around the way a gas transaction sort of works. So what happens is the buyer and the seller are selling natural gas using a NASB contract. 99% of all of the gas bought and sold, and the physical gas bought and sold in the U.S. is done through the NASB contract. And so, but it's transported on the pipeline, most likely an interstate pipeline, sometimes 2 or 3 to get from buyer to seller. And so it's got a lot of different connections between trying to keep data correct between the buyer and the seller and what the pipeline's delivering and what's been allocated. And so at the end of the month, what happens is the seller creates an invoice as a PDF, attaches it to an email, and sends it to the buyer. And that's how the gas is. So it's got a lot of automation, but it's also got a lot of manual steps between scheduling gas, going on to the bulletin boards, and doing things of that nature. So the efficiencies are pretty good until you have an area like a Winter Storm Uri we had 2 years ago. And there, it's really got a really intense data requirements for everyone. And so that's where we start seeing the inefficiencies really hit hard. So that's probably number one, is on the efficiencies of how the market operates and all the manual processes that go on.
So you talked about all the different transactions or different places the data needs to be, or different components from delivering gas from end to end. So what's the problem statement there that you're trying to solve, or what's the challenge? You say it's inefficient. Help me understand what that means.
Well, let's take, for example, that invoice. So a seller sells, let's say, $100,000 a day of gas to the purchaser, to the buyer, and so that's totals out to about $3 million. Let's say it's 30 days. So there's the invoice for $3 million. Well, the buyer looks at it and says, well, is that the right number? Looks into their ETRM system. The invoice has to come by the 10th of the month, has to be paid by the 25th of the month. And so if that matches, we're good to go. But in many cases, there might have been a pipeline cut or an allocation or something that occurred that the seller didn't recognize or the buyer picked up. And so then there's a quantity out of whack. And so there might be a $50,000 discrepancy in the invoice. And so at that point, the purchaser has to go back and look at all of their systems. The seller has to look at all their systems and try to figure out where they're out of balance on the quantity. If they're all in good shape on the quantity, then they have to go back to the price and see, hey, did we pick up the right index price? Do we have the right adder on it? Do we have this or that? And so that all has to be done in a fairly short time because it's due, of course, by the 25th of the month. And so because the invoices are so large that it might require adjustment later on. They have to close the books for the companies, but there's still this outstanding $3 million, and how does it break one way or other? So I think that's one that we look at, and you say, gosh, is there a better way to do that? And so I think we could talk about.
So how was it done before you said there's a better way? Is this something that I have a spreadsheet open that I was tracking the deal? Is this something I just get my purchase order and I'm manually matching it to my invoice? What's happening before you got involved to help make this more efficient?
Well, I think when you look at each company, it really depends on the company. I'd say probably most use spreadsheets. So it's a spreadsheet type, keeping track of it. Then the spreadsheet information gets pushed into an ETRM of some type or gas. So once those are put into the ETRM, that's where the real invoice comes out of. But each one does their own, just depending on the size and the volume, and so it just depends. There's 2,000, 3,000 different buyers and sellers of natural gas in the U.S. And some of those would be local distribution companies. Some of those would be generators, industrial customers. Some of them is LNG starting to take a very large percentage of of the natural gas market. So each one probably does it different, Chris. So
with each of those steps, you mentioned a bunch of data points you have to check along the way. Is each step reporting in then at the way it is? Are they saying, okay, well, I just passed this gas hub, or I did this or that? Is there then a checkpoint that takes place? Or is there a document that's submitted from each hop along the way? Or how do they know where the discrepancy is?
Good question. Well, the pipeline is the source of truth for the volume. So that's where you have to go back and check, did everybody catch all the messages from the pipeline correctly and get them into the billing system or ETRM. And then, it's basically just an invoice that's got quantities and price on it. Okay. So those are the two, but an allocation or cut might occur at different points along the pipeline. To make things a little bit more complex, there's storage and pools and multiple pipelines to get from the seller to the buyer. So all of that adds some complexity to the transaction and the tracking.
Okay, so you said that you've been working on this problem or to make it less complex. So if we turn the clock ahead to today or what the future of crystal ball might be, how do we make this complex issue simpler for North American Gas?
Well, I would say I did want to touch base with you and give you one additional challenge that's been that we faced, and that's over in the cybersecurity area. Every year we have cyber attacks, and it's certainly the energy infrastructure is a prime target. We've had a few ransomware attacks. Many of them have been public publicly stated or published. So the sorry about that. So some of the reports have been public, and like the Colonial Products Pipeline ransomware. 2018, we had a ransomware, the EDI vendor that caused pretty big ramifications for some of our large pipelines on market cap. And interesting enough, we were in the process of doing the Department of Energy does a security assessment of all the NASB standards every few years. And so this last assessment pointed out to the fact that you have a lot of different peer-to-peer type communications using EDI. So how do you know, NASB or the industry, that everybody's on the latest standard? Are they using stuff that was put out in the late 90s? And there are some trading partners that still use certificates and things from the 90s. And so, but NASB in the industry doesn't have a real easy way to look at it across the whole supply chain. All they can see is we put out the standard, we put out rules to say you need to get to the latest standard. And so cybersecurity, that's one of the points that the Sandia National Labs made in this last assessment. And as you know, cybersecurity is going to continue to be something we have to improve on every year because the hacking is getting more and more sophisticated. And so even though most of the concerns are on the physical side of natural gas, on the infrastructure and the pipelines, the OT, the IT can have a big effect if you shut down all of the ability to do scheduling and that kind of thing that the pipelines need to be able to move the gas.
Okay, so part of your initiative then would be the communication protocols to make sure that there's signatures, the right kind of encryption, and all the things that make sure I'm who I say I am and that I have the right to transmit to you, and you can validate who we are, right? That would be part of kind of how your standards would handle that. You talked about a lot to point was a problem statement. So is there an architectural change to change that point to point, or is it still a lot of point to point communications going forward, just in a more encrypted and secure way?
Well, today our approach at NASB has been to increase the security on the point-to-point as much as we can.
Okay.
And so with the Sandia Lab report, we took that back and made some updates to the standards. But the underlying issue that Sandia pointed out in their report was that as an industry, it's all point-to-point everywhere. So how do you get it? How do we ensure that the whole supply chain is secure? So I think that's still an outstanding question that we have to.
So are you working on like chains of trust and things like that? Is that kind of part of the fundamental?
Yeah, on the digital, NASB has a digital committee that looks at different strategies and what we should do. And distributed ledger is one of the ones that are on that list to look into. So I think those are technologies that are evolving, and so there may be a good way for the industry to go moving forward.
So as NASB is a standard body, and then you talk about DOE and other government entities, and I mentioned FERC and others. So there's other agencies in North America when we're dealing with all the power. But you said the standard body just suggests or makes a recommendation saying, here's the standards that you could use or perhaps should use. So is there a carrot and a stick? Is there a stick if you don't choose to do this? Other than you may not be able to deliver, you might get a cyber attack and get locked down. Is there any kind of...
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. So what the standards come out as basically a business rule, and then the business rule is looked at by FERC and FERC staff, and then they will take the business rule and adopt it as a NOPR. And then once they've adopted it, then that's standard by law that has some stick to the carrot part. Now that's not all of NASB standards. Some, particularly in the retail side, the retail is pretty much down at the Public Utility Commission. So a retail natural gas standard is usually done by whoever manages the state's gas business. But on the wholesale side, the FERC does adopt the rulemakings of NASB and turn them into NOPRs and hence the standard. So
I remember somewhere along the way where North American gas, since energy and so much is created by gas today, have you seen a big transition of how gas is handled? So, since it's now going maybe to generation for a big share, or maybe it's going to LNG distribution points, is it changing the volume or changing how gas transactions are done?
Well, I think it is considerably, I guess, increasing the amount of information and flow between the parties, because a lot of gas is used for combined cycled plants, which can start and stop very quickly. And so if you start hey, I'm going to be up for 21 hours running until we're past the demand and then it shuts down, that's a very intense demand on the pipeline or the LDC, whoever's providing that gas, because they have planned for it, but they typically don't. There's a concept of firm versus non-firm, where if you want to make sure you've got natural gas, you do a firm contract. Well, of course, that's a little more expensive than the non-firm, but it also guarantees you have gas if you need to start up for 21 hours. So I think that there's some concepts that we've had a long time within the supply chain, that as we start using electricity and on-demand electricity a lot more, it puts a strain on the on the pipeline from an operations perspective, but also from a data perspective on the users trying to figure out, okay, did I get the gas? Do I need more gas? Did I get a cut? Things of that nature. So I think the electrification is just causing the supply chain to have to increase its data flow and how quick it can react to starting up and stopping these generators.
So where is that supply chain and the evolution of that? Are we close to an alignment between the current speed of the data that you need and what the infrastructure that's in place handles, or is it in evolution right now, or does it need to evolve?
Well, I think probably, just my observation, there's a gas electric harmonization study going on at the moment. Meeting later this week if you're interested, but it meets every few weeks. It is a problem particularly around emergency weather events. So there's a great report that FERC-NERC did on the winter storm Uri. 200 or 300 pages, lots of information in there. But what happens is when we get into very, very tight supplies where there's different constraints put on the system, it gets to be very difficult to manage. Right now, a phone call, looking up something on a bulletin board, a pipeline bulletin board, is ample. But then when you start having cuts across entire ISOs, RTOs, then it starts having a bigger effect on the supply chain, and hence some of the outages. And I'm not sure of all this. We just had some winter storms here at Christmas in North America, and there was a strain on our, on the systems. We've got a bigger reliability on renewables now. Texas is 30% wind, and so you sort of depend on that, but you have an emergency and there's no wind, or the wind freezes up, then you got to get natural gas in there, but that's, can be problematic in a winter storm as well. So I think what we're seeing is we need to evolve, but it's a lot of information, but it's a small percentage of the time, because normal operations, you probably don't need all of that data automated, but during those storms or catastrophe events, you need to have a much quicker movement of data around.
So it's fair to say that things are kind of accelerating the need for the data depending on the situation, from what I've heard, based on the architecture of how power is today and in the startup and stop demand kind of curves, especially with renewables changing that, because you'll use the gas more for base load kind of things. And so, like you said, if there's no wind or something like that, I could see it changing. Um, does LNG play a part in this? I know some terminals have been finished recently. Europe needs gas, so there's an amount of North American gas going somewhere. Maybe it's Asia, but with the economy maybe being a bit slower, maybe it's going to Europe. It's been a bit warm this winter so far, so Europe's been lucky. But that could change. How does that play?
So LNG is increasing. I think it's over 10% of the market now. Probably will continue to increase. So I think the use of LNG will only add to the fact that we're using more wholesale natural gas. I think one thing, Chris, that's important when you look at LNG, particularly as you start sending gas to Europe, maybe not so much today, but certainly in the future, is being able to report on the quality or type of that gas. How much methane was used to get that gas to market. Is it certified? There's quite a few different certifiers. They take it from the wellhead or the field and certify the gas and get it over. And that's a requirement in Europe and for these exports. So
is that not a requirement within North America, though? I mean, the grade of what I buy, whether it's wet or dry, or what I can do with it, I think would be important to the value of it, right? Isn't the pricing somehow implied? I mean, just like you would in oil, like I would care about a bunch of factors. I'd imagine the same in gas. Is that not true?
No, it's true, or it's evolving. I think is it's a problem. It's on the problem statement now, and how do we handle that going forward? Because when you start off with let's say a producer, they start off and they've sold 50 megawatts to or 50 MMBTU to a purchaser, then they may have to put in 65 at the front end. So they have to get that certified, and then because it goes through processing, gathering, processing, goes through fuel through the pipeline. That's a charge that takes gas away. There's unaccounted for gas, and so 65 at the wellhead turns into 50 at the receipt point or delivery point to the in-use consumer. So tracking that can be very, very difficult. And so when you start doing a ESG reporting or FERC reporting, how does that certified gas that has a grade, you're exactly right, how does that get reported and from a consumption perspective? And so I think that's a big challenge. A lot of the on the rec market, retail electric side, there's always looking at making sure we don't do greenwashing and how do you do this or that, and so and keep track of it. It's not as prevalent of a loss really on the electric side, but in the gas side, that's just how the industry works. I mean, you put in so much, and some of it's used for fuel to run the compressor stations along the pipeline. So that's all by tariff.
So is there not also with Internet of Things more and more sensors? So methane sensor. I mean, there's always some leakage in gas, right? That's part of the trouble with gas infrastructure, right? There's expected things along the way. Is there more and more data coming into the equation from sensors and devices throughout the pipeline that didn't exist in the past, or is it pretty consistent?
Now there's more and more sensors, Chris, and some of them are revenue grade. Some of them are more geared towards the certified gas, and just measuring it on a real time basis. And that's part of the scoring of some of the wellheads out there, if they've got real time monitoring and can track it. But there's a long supply chain from the wellhead through the gathering system, through the processing system, till it gets to the pipeline, till it gets to goes through the compressor stations. Oh, it goes to a different pipeline. So there's a lot of movement with that physical gas. A lot of the certifications have really, or the certified gas and their certificates today are sort of a little bit more in financial oriented type vehicles. So 50 bought, 50 sold. Okay, that equals out. But in reality, the physical gas isn't one to one like that.
So is there also, I mean, the things that you hear from the outside, right, are, new gas pipelines aren't necessarily getting built in North America. There's plenty of gas supply in North America, whether you use unconventional means or however, there's plenty of gas, but the pipelines could be a problem. Is that problematic? Are you seeing that across the industry, that we have enough infrastructure for the demand?
What I hear, and I'm not in the pipeline business, is that we do need additional infrastructure. I think there's quite a few challenges in building new infrastructure, particularly in certain geographical areas. You probably get a pipeline built in Texas pretty quick, but I'm not sure about the Northeast. So, but I think that is a challenge that the pipelines face in building up their infrastructure.
And then what about renewable gas? Is there, you talked about the provenance of gas, right? Greenwashing so you have a common infrastructure. So are people putting renewable gas into the pipelines as well? And is that accounted for in the processes you have? So is there, kind of like distributed electricity, if you had renewable gas, is that getting contributed to the North American pipelines right now?
Yes, it is, but in a pretty small degree, of course. There's requirements. It starts getting down to on state requirements. So California has some hefty goals and laws in that area. So tracking that isn't certainly important. But whether that gas is coming off of dairy farms or coming off of landfills or wherever it's coming, getting it into the pipeline, of course, then all of the molecules are mixing up, but tracking what went in and what went out and making sure. And again, it still has to go. Some of those pipelines are burning it as fuel. So how do you account for the fact that, okay, I put this much in, but 3% goes to fuel. So where does that, how does that get accounted for?
And then, so you said that recent assessment showed cybersecurity is one of the top concerns. And I do remember certainly the attacks that you talked about. I remember they made mainstream news, even they were pretty significant. What other pain points are people looking at today? So what are the pain points that you'd expect to be evolving over the next 12 to 24 months from a technology point of view or from the whole supply chain?
Well, there's a recent addendum to certified natural gas. There's a recent NASB addendum that's come out. It's in the ratification process. It is an addendum to the NASB buy-sell agreement. That is the contract that 99% of probably all of gas bought and sold in the U.S. goes through. And the addendum really ties the gas to a facility. So if you looked at the addendum, you'd see that the location is in there, the grade, who the certifier is. There's several certifiers that have great methodologies, and they do quite an extensive study on the different fields and or wells. So I think that's going to be a big challenge in keeping track of all that additional information.
So what about liquidity? You mentioned earlier, I think it was about a 10-day window to settlement that you had, if I caught the numbers that you said correctly. With technology, right? Settlement could theoretically be done in near real time. It could be done, with enough time to have some netting. There's different choices when it might be optimal. Have folks been looking at getting better liquidity or improving their cash flow by changing that settlement cycle at all?
Well, yeah, great point. I think if you go back to that example of, okay, it's $100,000 a day that the buyer and seller are transacting on. Well, at the end of the month, of course, it's $3 million. Well, then it's not due until the 25th of that month. So if you flowed gas on the first, that $100,000 from the very first of the month to the end, you've got a 55-day hold on that. So the liquidity, it does have a pretty big impact on the capital
Your
requirement.
credit risk exposure, I mean, there's a number of things, right? And credit risk
Right.
is also one of your most expensive things when you're in trading, right? That's one of your biggest line items.
Yes. So
what's being done about that?
So one thought is that if you can get to a distributed ledger, some kind of ledger that allows you to track that on a more real-time basis, again, the quantity comes from the pipeline, so you won't have real-time settlement, but you could settle within a few days, and so that would assist. A way to step into that might be that instead of being due on the 25th, you do distributed ledger, and then at the end of the month, you've already sort of reconciled and made sure everything was good, and so you could settle on the 4th. So there's different ways of looking at how you might want to implement that, but the distributed ledger helps bring all those different spreadsheets, ETRMs, all that different data that each buyer and seller has into that common source of truth that would allow for that settlement to occur quicker.
So has NASB or other industry members done any studies on what the optimal settlement period would be for gas, right? So, I mean, obviously 55 days is quite a long time if you deliver on the first, in that case. But even if you were delivering in the end of the month, you would still have 10 days, and the dollar signs could be pretty big, right? You gave a fairly small number, but it could be fairly significant dollars that move back and forth. Any thoughts on what that optimum number of days is?
We'd have to go through the process of discussing, but I would suspect that it's closer to 3 or 4 days, just because you need to get the information back from the pipeline. The pipelines are also making adjustments along the way, so they may make an adjustment, the nominated scheduled quantity amount, then going over to the allocated amount, and then they can find out that they may have a meter problem, a month or 2 months down the road, and have to come back and redo it. That's very rare, but it's a possibility, and it's something that does occur. So, but I think you take the information that's going to be correct, 99+% of the time, and use it and settle out, and with the idea that if something does occur and you need to go back and make a change, just like today, that can come up to 60 days later with the change, you'd be able to adjust the invoice and move forward, or the invoice amount.
So when you get an invoice today, you have an invoice, the pipeline would generate the invoice, I assume. Is that who's generating it?
Well, there's the energy invoice and the transportation invoice.
Okay, so the energy invoice is from a trader then, from a.
Yes. So the seller of the natural gas, let's just say it's a producer of natural gas, would generate the invoice and send it to the buyer, and that would be for the natural gas.
Okay, and is the invoice then inclusive of the pipeline invoice in that then?
No, the pipeline invoice would come from the pipeline to the buyer and to the seller. So depending on what services they used and how much they transmitted, then they would get their individual invoices from the pipeline.
And so then the buyer would issue a purchase order or a shadow invoice to match theoretically what they purchased, right? So that's where they're double checking to make everything's right. Is that normal process?
Yeah. Normal, I mean, I'm simplifying it, but normal processes is that the buyer's gas accounting group gets the invoice and looks at it, says, yep, that's exactly what we expected because that's what our ETRM system says. Great. Put it in the paid pile or pay it pile. If it's not, then it's to what degree do we need to go back and go through? And it's typically, I think, is look at all the quantities. Do those match? If they do, then go back and look through the price, how each was priced, and see if those match, and that's how they find it. But these invoices are, fairly. They've
So
got
how
big.
many line items would when you're saying they're fairly, is this like 1,000 line items or?
Yeah, it could be 5 to 10, maybe larger pages. Depends. It's seasonal too, so depending on how much is the winter time's a little bit bigger activity than the shoulder months. But the summer's busy.
But
But
summer with air conditioning is growing as well, right? Because we produce so much electricity from gas that
yeah,
both summer and winter tend to be spikes as well, right?
yeah. Geographically, you would find that usage in Florida in the summer would be a lot greater than. But then again, in the wintertime, you're going to find the Northeast use a lot higher than in Florida. So.
Well, cool. Well, I think I have enough knowledge to be dangerous from this conversation. I think we've gone a bit of places of where we've gone. So I think the recap that I can make what we've talked about so far is that there's a standards body that basically is helping make this more efficient. Your idea is to make sure communication is secure and well defined, and that the regulators would then look at the recommendations and see if they enjoy those. If they do, they would basically mandate or encourage everybody to use those. That was the stick we talked about. And if you do put these things in place, that the business can benefit from maybe shorter settlement cycles and being just much more efficient. Is that recap kind of my takeaway of what we've gone through in the last 30 minutes, maybe?
Yep, I think that's a good synopsis of all the challenges and things that are going on.
So from where you sit, are you bullish or are you a bear about, do we solve some of these problems? Are we at a point where it's enough of a pain point that the North American industry is going to say, hey, we want to get settlement to be more efficient. These spreadsheets are just a lot of work. And frankly, most industries aren't using spreadsheets for complex stuff anymore. Is that where we're at? Is that inflection point taking place today?
Yes, but being Chief Digital Officer at Big Data Energy, I see a lot of different technologies that we use to help our clients in solving it. I think some of the technology, robotic process automation, is continuing to really be good tool for using with picking up data from bulletin boards and everything.
But isn't that a first step? So having been in the space, as you probably can tell by some of the questions, the robotic or workflow management kind of tools tended to be for advanced people's early stage, right? It solved the problem incrementally. But from what we've seen in deployments for shortening settlement cycles and stuff in Europe, that was an incremental step, to be pretty candid, right? It's kind of like PDFs are still, for lack of a better term, those are still paper, right? PDFs eventually become XML or something more efficient down the road, or some other way to move things where they're not necessarily needing to be a PDF, right? So I see
right.
PDF, I think workflow automation is an incremental step. Is that along with your thinking, or is that just me projecting a thought that I had on you?
Well, I think it's a needed. That's a great point. It's just, how long is that transitory period? So, if you say, oh yeah, that's going to be 6 months or a year, well, no, it's going to be a transitory period that's years. So there's a technology. How do we go to the next step of technology to keep going? And with the robotic process automation, I've seen a lot of different implementations, but they typically are pretty easy to get up and running, but they don't. But sometimes when they're done, they're not operationalized very well. So when you have something in place and you get to the close at the end of the month and you realize your robots didn't run for the last 2 weeks for some reason, you don't have that data, then you're like, oh, this is even worse than before. So what we've seen is that's a good way to step into the next technology and to evolve. Because, face it, at some point we're just going to be moving with APIs and all sorts of private permission to distributed ledgers and things of that nature. And so, but you can't do the big bang on the big natural gas supply chain because you have the buyers, you have the pipelines, you have the end use consumers, you have the LDCs, you have all sorts of different players that are in the midst of large system upgrades or moving to the cloud or revamping. So they've got plenty of other projects on their plate. So it's not like you can just say, okay, the standard is this, go forward and prosper. So it's a bigger challenge, particularly when you look at trying to get just like distributed ledger in place, because wow, that's great technology, but I just spent $50 million upgrading my ETRM, and it doesn't have an API to that distributed ledger. So how do we get from where we are today to someplace in the future that does have the APIs and the security and the private permission distributed ledgers of that nature? So I think EDI, it's been around 25 years. It may be still here another 10 years, 15 years, I don't know. But it's one that I look at as over the next few years is a bit transitory in nature. Is that how long will it continue to be part of the supply chain? So bulletin boards, same thing. They've been around for a while. Great source of information. Pipelines have done a great job putting those together, making them consistent. But those are expensive to maintain and keep up and running. And probably a source, though, that I haven't heard of any public hacking, but probably something that they really have to defend hard from a internal IT group with that exposure.
Well, so I think the gray field problem, if it was greenfield, as we talked about in a pre-call and earlier in the week, I think it would be easy, right? We could, as technologists, we could architect a perfect system, but everybody's at a different spot on the journey, which I think makes the challenge. But we all need to have a target or have an architecture that we're trying to build for with the current technology, right? And so I think you described a lot of the problem statements. I think you mentioned folks on the journey where they are. I want to thank you for sharing a bit of insight into the industry with myself and our audience here on Insider's Guide to Energy. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time this first half of the year talking about gas. We'll focus a bit on North American gas as well, because it's of interest to a number of folks. I've gotten a lot of feedback on it. And I think this is a good primer to understand at the highest level how things are working and what people are trying to lean towards. So, Cade, thank you so much for being a guest on Insider's Guide to Energy.
Thank you, Chris. It was a pleasure, and I always like your insightful questions and our discussion. So thanks. You have a great day.
And for our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you've enjoyed it as much as I have, please share it, subscribe, find it on the YouTube channel, look for us on Facebook, and join us again next week. Bye-bye.